pledging to make America great again, hearkening back to a time pre-integration, and providing a legislative home for overt white supremacists. That'll get you onto this list. Hi, I'm Reese Waters, and I'm troubled. I don't think the president likes black people. I'm just playing. Most of them haven't, which is why, and also in honor of our franchise Racist of the Week, I compiled this list of the 7 worst presidents for black Americans. First, our honorable mentions. The 37th president, Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1974. Quote, "We have reaped not a solution of poverty, but we've reaped the riots that have torn 300 cities apart, resulted in 200 dead and 7,000 injured throughout this country," end quote. Richard Nixon said that on October 3rd, 1968 at a town hall in an Atlanta TV studio that aired live all across the South. He vowed to restore, quote, "law and order," and decried those who would destroy America, who would burn it. He won the White House a month later. It became known as Nixon's Southern Strategy, a campaign that used fear of crime and lawlessness to tap into white Southern voters' opposition to racial integration and equality without using those overtly racist languages and tropes. It was a strategy that Republicans honed gradually over decades, ultimately achieving dominance all across the South, and a political realignment that changed the electoral map for presidential candidates, the makeup of Congress, and the tenor of the American debate about race. Definitely for the worst. If there was any further doubt, an internal memo for Nixon's 1968 campaign lays the intent to harness racial division quite bare. Drawing conservative Democrats, the GOP ticket would turn on, quote, "the law and order / Negro socioeconomic revolution syndrome" that came from campaign strategist Kevin Phillips. Our next honorable mention, our 42nd president, Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001. What? Y'all know why he's here. The most extensive federal crime legislation ever passed, with an added assist to future President Joe Biden. The 1994 crime bill helped pay for new federal prisons if states agreed to force offenders to serve 85% of their sentence, funded the hiring of 100,000 more police officers across the country, and the creation of the federal, quote, 3 strikes rule, which mandated life in prison for people who committed 3 violent felonies. The crime bill also allowed prosecutors to charge 13-year-old children as adults for certain crimes, and as a result, today, 2/3 of Americans who were sentenced to life in prison as juveniles are black, and juveniles of color also constitute a majority of cases that are transferred to adult criminal court, regardless of the offense category. All right, let's start the list. Coming in at number 7, our 45th president, Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021. Okay, Hoteps. Here's a cookie. Donald Trump signed a major sentencing and prison reform bill into law known as the First Step Act. It required the Federal Bureau of Prisons to increase the quantity and quality of rehabilitative programming. First Step also made modest reforms to some of the worst war on drugs era federal sentencing laws, and 90% of those receiving reductions have been black. Also, black poverty reached a historic low in 2019, and President Trump designated over 8,500 opportunity zones to spur private investment in minority communities. But reinstituting the Southern Strategy more than 50 years later is going to get you on this list. Pledging to make America great again, hearkening back to a time pre-integration, and providing a legislative home for overt white supremacists. That'll get you onto this list. And quite frankly, I'm thinking about how badly he handled the summer of 2020.
I am your president of law and order.
I'm quite frankly shocked that he isn't higher. They must have really done some real dirt, and spoiler alert, they did. Coming up next, our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 1929. Now, you remember President Bush's FEMA response to Hurricane Katrina? Yeah, that had nothing on President Coolidge's response to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. In an attempt to alleviate pressure on levees, predominantly black riverside communities were flooded, while most white communities were spared. And the displaced black population who had just lost their homes, they were forced to work for rations under watchful guns of the National Guard and local planters, because why not give them the ability to shoot their neighbors as well? This dire situation escalated into a disturbing wave of mass beatings, lynchings, and all kinds of assaults. Use your imagination. Adding to Coolidge's controversial legacy, he signed the Immigration Act of 1924, a legislation widely regarded as one of the most racist and ethnocentric in history. The measure, championed by Republican eugenicists and Democratic Klansmen, because you always want eugenicists and Klansmen on your side, it was co-authored by Washington Congressman Albert Johnson. Rooted in discriminatory ideologies like the Yellow Peril, which targeted West Coast Asians, the act significantly curtailed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and also placed severe restrictions on African immigrants and imposed outright bans on immigrants from Arab and Asian origins. Coolidge's commitment to maintaining an American identity, as stated in his 1923 message to Congress, further fueled the discriminatory provisions of this legislation. Coming up next, our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921. And this should be good because his estate has been apologizing for him for years. All right. The man who came from Princeton never turned his back on the racist ideas he produced as a Princeton political scientist. President Wilson oversaw the re-segregation of the federal government. Yeah, not the segregation, the re-segregation. Black federal workers were fired, and those that remained faced separate and unequal workspaces, lunchrooms, and bathrooms. He also refused to appoint black ambassadors to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as was custom. And it takes a special kind of discrimination to be like, oh, that's the one thing that we gave y'all? Yeah, I'm taking that away. Notably, both as a professor and later as a president, Wilson unabashedly supported the, quote, great Ku Klux Klan and endorsed their violent disenfranchisement of Southern African Americans in the late 19th century. In 1915, Wilson initiated a brutal 2-decade U.S. occupation of Haiti, depriving Haitians of the opportunity for self-governance. And perhaps most controversially, during the Versailles Convention in 1919, which settled World War I, it was President Wilson who played a pivotal role in thwarting Japan's proposal for a treaty recognizing racial equality. Yeah, this decision upheld the longevity of European colonialism, marking a critical moment in history. And you know it's bad when I ain't even get to birth of a nation. Number 4, our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Oh yeah, FDR, 1933 to 1945. Now, despite Eleanor Roosevelt's notable activism and involvement in civil rights, that couldn't shield her husband from inclusion on this list. Now, one of the most egregious examples of Roosevelt's racist policies, his 1942 executive order, which resulted in the forced internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, although he spared German and Italian Americans from such treatment, which somehow actually makes it more offensive. But after the 1936 Berlin Olympics, while white American athletes received invitations to the White House, Jesse Owens, the 4-time gold medal winner, did not. Now, this exclusion occurred even as Roosevelt was championing progressive legislation like minimum wage, Social Security, and unemployment insurance through the New Deal. However, those features of the New Deal excluded farmers and domestics, primary occupations for Southern blacks, and allowed local administration of federal relief. These policies satisfied Southern segregationists quite a bit. Additionally, housing discrimination and New Deal initiatives further pleased Northern segregationists, let's get all the segregationists on our side, by coding black neighborhoods as unsuitable for new mortgages. Consequently, black communities continued to suffer through the Great Depression, while the New Deal combined with the GI Bill contributed to the expansion of the white middle class, solidifying a wealth gap we still see today. Number 3, our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. The year was 1971. Then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, tells President Nixon, quote, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
To see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Yeah, he was saying that about diplomats. It only got worse from there. The architect of the infamous welfare queen myth, who invoked the divisive notions of states' rights, perfected President Richard Nixon's notorious Southern strategy, successfully deploying it on a national scale. Reagan skillfully attracted voters through racially coded appeals, allowing them to support his agenda without explicitly acknowledging their racist undertones. At the helm of a reactionary movement, Reagan played a role in rolling back some of the tangible gains achieved by civil rights and Black Power activists. In President Reagan's inaugural year, the median income of Black families plummeted by 5.2%, and the number of poor Americans, disproportionately Black, surged by 2.2 million, a foreshadowing of the challenges under Reaganomics. In 1982, Reagan launched his war on drugs.
And because of increasing organized crime involvement in drug abuse, we will establish 12 additional task forces in key areas in the United States.
Despite drug use having been declining at the time. I wonder why. Now, while President Reagan didn't intervene to prevent the CIA-backed Contra rebels in Nicaragua from smuggling cocaine into the United States to finance their operations, he did actively direct attention to their distribution of crack cocaine in 1985. This media-driven blitz gave substantial boost to his war on drugs in 1986, and that autumn, Reagan enthusiastically signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, instituting minimum sentencing for drug offenses and setting the stage for the mass incarceration of Black and brown drug offenders in the subsequent decades. Yes, decades. President Reagan, building on Nixon's tactics, elevated the racist drug war to new heights through both campaign strategies and policy actions. Now, that is the third mention of Nixon. He came up with Trump and he came up with Reagan. How could he be honorable mention? Well, I guess, Trump was 50 years later. So it's definitely worse if you behave that way like 5 decades after the fact. And then Reagan was more effective. So I imagine he should be lower on the list than they are. But he's like the father that birthed their coded racist ideologies. Maybe I'll just name the whole list after Nixon. Coming in second, our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. That's 1829 to 1837. Now, Andrew Jackson assumed the presidency as a prosperous Tennessee enslaver and military general, having played a pivotal role in founding and leading the Democratic Party. The coalition formed by Jacksonian Democrats included Southern enslavers, white working class individuals, and recent European immigrants who frequently engaged in riots against abolitionists, indigenous populations, Black communities, and civil rights activists both before and after the Civil War. So shout out to Jackson. In response to the national attention garnered by the mass mailings of anti-slavery tracts in 1835, Jackson urged Congress to enact a law that would impose severe penalties for circulating, quote, incendiary publications. Okay, so it's the anti-slavery publications that are incendiary, not the, slavery. Okay, I think I got it. Subsequently, Jackson and his supporters introduced the notorious gag rule in the following year, effectively sidelining all anti-slavery petitions flooding into Congress. Yes, they passed a gag rule. They wouldn't even hear the word or discuss slavery in Congress. And somebody who's behaving as he was, you think would have a little bit thicker skin. I believe Andrew Jackson was the original snowflake. With the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Jackson compelled numerous Native American nations to relocate from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to areas west of the Mississippi, a displacement aimed at clearing the path for forcibly transported enslaved Africans into the Deep South. President Jackson played a key role in carving out this trail of Native American tears from the Deep South and the subsequent trail of African tears into the Deep South. And this is the man they wanted to put on the back of Harriet Tubman. All right, it's time for number 1. Get my drum roll ready. Y'all know who it is. The 17th president, Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869. Now, this Democratic leader from Tennessee assumed the presidency following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth, just days after the conclusion of the Civil War. Johnson's Reconstruction proclamations, issued around a month later on May 29, 1865, dashed all expectations of civil rights activists. He extended amnesty, property rights, and voting rights to all except the highest-ranking Confederate officials whom he later pardoned a year later. Furthermore, he directed the return of land to pardoned Confederates, invalidated wartime orders granting black individuals 40 acres and a mule. Y'all remember that. He messed it up. And he removed many black troops from the South. Empowered by President Johnson, Confederates introduced a series of discriminatory black codes during the constitutional conventions that reshaped Southern states in the summer and fall of 1865. The immediate post-war South closely resembled the pre-war South in everything but name, as the law replaced the master. These racist policies sparked a post-war conflict with an unknown number of black folks losing their lives in resistance. Congress actually had to intervene to dismantle the resurgence of the Confederacy in all but name, but President Johnson vetoed both the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and Civil Rights Bill of 1866, leading Congress to override his veto. He also opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and in 1868, he became the first American president to face impeachment by the House of Representatives. Despite being acquitted in the Senate by a single vote, President Johnson's historical legacy remains as the worst president of all time, literally for all people. To summarize, we had Donald Trump at 7, Calvin Coolidge at 6, Woodrow Wilson at 5, FDR at 4, Ronald Reagan at 3, Andrew Jackson at 2, and Andrew Johnson as the worst president for Black Americans and white and Asian and Spanish. He was just the worst. There must be something about the name Andrew. I don't know. Now, by the way, if you have any ideas, suggestions, or grounds for reconsideration, feel free to leave those in the comments, especially about Nixon. That one's going to keep me up tonight. Or about Andrew Johnson. I'm going to have to do a whole separate video about him. Be sure to like and share the video and subscribe to the page for future editions.